Mr. President, as a passionate believer in the importance of science and evidence-based research, and especially in the need for strong and urgent action on global warming, which threatens the very life support systems of our planet, I wanted tonight to rise to pay tribute to the lives of two outstanding Australian climate scientists. I'd like to start by talking about Professor Michael Raupach, who had a long career at the CSIRO, was the inaugural chairman of the Global Carbon Project, and he died on the 10th of February this year, aged 64. It is a very sad loss to the science community and to Australia, and I want to pay tribute to him and to his courage, and I'll later talk about Emeritus Professor Tony McMichael. But first, Michael Raupach. During his PhD studies a long time ago, he built his own measurement and data processing system, becoming a pioneer in a technology that is today replicated at hundreds of flux towers in a global network. He had a 35-year career in CSIRO as a great science leader, and he was also a contributing author to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Fourth Assessment Report. He became the ANU Climate Change Institute Director in 2014. During his career, he published more than 150 scientific papers and 50 reports. He edited 2 books. In recent years, he co-chaired the working group drafting the Australian Academy of Science booklet, The Science of Climate Change, Questions and Answers. Last year, Professor Raupach moved from CSIRO to take up the directorship of the Australian National University's Climate Change Institute. His work on the global carbon cycle and global carbon budget showed the rapid growth of emissions and declining efficiency of natural carbon sinks, explored current and future emission trajectories linked to economic development, and devised ways to think about the responsibility of nations to address climate mitigation. He was an outstanding climate scientist, but more particularly, he had enormous courage in not only doing this research, but in communicating that research to the public and having the courage to go out there and take this on. In a speech that he made, in a speech to the Australian Academy of Science, he said, "To pretend that science, and in particular environmental science, can remain at the side of that debate is simply no longer tenable, and any statement environmental science chooses to make carries implications about those choices, and there's a very important call for the scientific community to be fully engaged in that public debate, fully participating in it." And he had been doing that for decades, and in particular, in the early years, he was part of the action against nuclear weapons, scientists against nuclear weapons, as long ago as the 1980s. He was a scientist committed to celebrating nature and the natural world, and in alerting us and future generations, of course, to what is going on with global warming. I want to particularly pay tribute to his passion, his intellect. He had enormous respect from the scientific community, and he had great courage. As Professor Will Steffen has said, he was an outstanding scientist, always rigorous and insightful. He demonstrated great leadership on the Global Carbon Project, and he was a wonderful human being, and we're all going to miss him very much. And I'd just like to conclude in his own words with regard to the late Professor Michael Raupach. He was asked about his feelings about global warming, and he had this to say: "My feelings about climate change are a mixture of awe, hope, despair, frustration and anger." In terms of awe, he said, "Climate change is part of climate, and climate is part of the natural world that sustains us. It's majestic and beautiful. Hope: humans are incredibly smart. We have the capabilities to repair climate and to lighten our footprints to what the planet can sustain. Despair: humans are incredibly dumb. We find it very hard to think beyond me here and now, yet our task is to fix a generation of problems that are global and centennial, to learn to share a finite planet. Vale, McMichael, Raupach. I now move to talk about the late Professor Tony McMichael, who died in September last year at the age of 71. He too was an outstanding, eminent Australian epidemiologist. He retired in 2012 from the Australian National University, where he, at that time, previously had held the National Health and Medical Research Council Australia Fellowship, and he was, of course, a very valued member of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, was a lead author, and had been since 1993. He had been out there on the issue of global warming and particularly the impacts on public health. He had a deep knowledge of earth sciences. He had a deep knowledge across archaeology, geography, climatology and health. Incredible work on that epidemiology. His interest in patterns of infectious disease emergence and spreading focused on emerging health risks to poorer populations, and he went on to talk about what was going to happen with global warming. And he said, "The greatest impact of climate change in poorer populations will be the sheer burden of disease and the increased numbers of deaths from things like cholera and dysentery, and in a world more prone to flooding that will create overloaded sanitary systems, that I think will be the major problems unless we get seriously engaged in the eradication of poverty and the improvement of living conditions in these poorer parts of the world very quickly." He was a very well-published academic, including over 300 peer-reviewed papers, 160 book chapters, and so on, in terms of a brilliant academic career. But I also wish to just refer to something that he said in 2013. He said, "A shared public understanding of these potentially great climate change risks to the human, social, ecological system should now be reinforcing the urgent need to take national preventative action. This will require an extraordinary trans-political response, comprising strong leadership from the Australian Government via open and community-engaged discussion of this fundamental threat to human societies, their populations and the natural environmental systems that supports all life." Professor Tony McMichael was regarded extremely highly, not only here in Australia but right around the world, as an epidemiologist, as a scientist, as a person who cared very much about this and future generations. And so, in his own words, he said, "It's hard to imagine that people are doing so much damage to the natural world. It's sad when a society like ours can't see further than its bank balance and stumbles blindly into a future when children won't be able to enjoy the flowing rivers, mountain snow, coloured birds and bush animals. Don't we have any responsibility for other creatures, forests and rivers? I'm rather ashamed of our behaviour." It seems silly to go on behaving like this, though. From hearing our politicians speak, it seems that making and consuming more and more is the point of life. Surely the dreadful heat we've suffered from in the recent heat waves and the awful bushfires that have terrified rural communities in the past couple of years are telling us that something's going wrong. He finished that statement by saying, "It's really sad that some of our local children seem quite puzzled and worried by what they see on TV about this and hearing what adults say. I hope my family and our community can try and help solve these frightening problems." Well, they both did do everything to try and solve these problems. And in 2050, people will look back and say, why in Australia did we not take the action we knew was necessary from the science? And I want to say to people in 2050, people like Tony McMichael and Professor Michael Raupach did tell everybody. They did have the courage to stand up. They did have the courage to speak out for now and for future generations, and I pay tribute to them both for the courage and the scientific endeavour and the care that they showed in the time that